Good evening. My name is Kai Bird. I'm the executive director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, as some of you know. This is our 10th anniversary, thanks to Shelby White, our sole benefactor, who's been funding this program, which allows us to give award fellowships to 4 biographers at Hard at Work every year. Some of our fellows are in the audience tonight. Bruce Weber is working on E.L. Doctorow. Eleanor Randolph is here. She's working on Michael Bloomberg. Justin Gifford is doing a biography of Eldridge Cleaver. And Lindsay Whalen is doing Mary Oliver, the poet. And we also have a PhD student who's doing a biography of Henry Kissinger. Her name is Mickey Kaufman. Our next event is with Michael Massing, who's also a former fellow, who's only been working on his biography of Martin Luther and Erasmus for about 15 years. Biography takes a long time. Anyway, that event will be February 27th at 7:30 at the Strand Bookstore. And on March 15th, our own Thad Zilkowski at the back of the room there will be interviewing Chris Kraus, the acclaimed author of I Love Dick, on her biography of the literary icon Kathy Acker. Tonight we are honored to have with us Max Boot, whose new biography of Edward Lansdale has been making waves, so to speak. Max is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and the author of 3 previous books, Invisible Armies, An Epic History of Guerrilla Warfare from Ancient Times to the Present, War Made New, Technology, Warfare, and the Course of History, The Savage Wars of Peace, Small Wars, and the Rise of American Power. Anyway, I'm really delighted that Max has finally decided to become a biographer.
Me too.
To my mind, biography is much more penetrating than even epic history. But maybe Max disagrees. The Vietnam War is still an open wound. And there have been many history books about it. But I think some of the best explanations of the war are indeed biographical. You think of Neil Sheehan's Bright Shining Lie, a biography of John Paul Vann, a character very similar, in fact, discussed in Max's book. I think Neil Sheehan also spent 15 years on his biography. People of my generation always have stories about the Vietnam War. Mine in particular is that it's the only time I spent a few hours behind bars was when I was arrested in 1970 trying to block the doors of a draft induction center in Minneapolis. I was 19 years old, and it was an experience. 2 years later, one McGeorge Bundy came to my college, Carleton College, and gave a lecture. And I was astonished. Here was this man whom I thought of as a war criminal standing before us, giving a lecture, clearly very bright, clearly very liberal, former Harvard dean. I just couldn't understand how he could have gotten us into this morass of a war. And so many years later, I spent 7 years of my life writing a biography of Bundy, trying to figure out that question. And along the way, I encountered Edward Lansdale and wrote a bit about him, a very thumbnail sketch in my biography of Bundy called The Color of Truth. And clearly, it was a thumbnail. But fortunately, we now have Max Boot's 700-page biography, and he does what I failed.
More than a thumbnail.
More than a thumbnail.
It's like the whole hand.
And Max and I are going to now have a little conversation going back and forth. And we'll have time at the end of that conversation to have questions. And along the way, occasionally, Max may click a button and we'll see some pictures from the book. So with that.
But only if you guys are super good.
Okay. I think we're ready.
Great.
Is
Thanks
this
for
mic
having me.
working? Okay.
It's a privilege to be back here, especially the last occasion being a memorable one where you were in the bio organization honoring my editor, Bob Weil, who's a tremendous editor. So I would not be sitting here if it weren't for Bob Weil.
That's right. And he is indeed a great editor and very patient with his biographers, I hear.
Yes, very.
So I'd like to begin discussing your Lansdale biography, where your book intersects with actually my last book, which was a biography of Robert Ames, a CIA officer. And Lansdale was also briefly, well, for some years working for the agency. And you make a good case that Lansdale has been misunderstood, that and you draw a good comparison between him and T.E. Lawrence and my own Robert Ames. And both were, well, I called Ames my good spy because he was very good at his job. He was filled with empathy and a desire to understand foreign targets. And so too was Lansdale. And at one point you quote Lansdale saying, "There is a lesson here for everyone concerned with control of foreign persons or groups. The strongest control is one that is self-imposed. It is based on mutual trust and the awakening of unselfish patriotism. Once established, the foreign person or groups serve our own best national interests by serving their own national interests." So in a sense, one of the bigger themes, as I see it, of your biography is to raise again the whole debate about what is good intelligence and the value of human intelligence over all this intercept intelligence that we're now spending billions of dollars on. Is that a fair observation?
Yeah, thanks for picking up on that. That's an aspect of the book. I've been going around the country for a couple months now talking about the book, and nobody's interested in that aspect of it, but I'm happy to talk about it because I think that was one of the interesting things about Lansdale, and that kind of like Ames, he was a maverick within the CIA, a little bit different. I mean, even more of a maverick because, Ames was actually a professional case officer where Lansdale was not. I mean, he was not, he was a professional advertising man. That was his actual occupation prior to World War II. And then he got into the OSS, the first civilian intelligence agency, and then got into the Army and the Air Force. And he only served in the CIA on loan from the Air Force from 1950 to 1956, but those were his years of greatest success, first in the Philippines, working with Ramon Magsaysay, and then in South Vietnam, working with Ngo Dinh Diem. And he certainly was unconventional in every respect. He was very unconventional for a military guy, in that he didn't believe in the use of massive overwhelming force. He really believed in winning hearts and minds, but he was also very unusual for the CIA in that he did not believe in controlling assets in the way that, and this was something that Robert Ames struggled with the Red Prince, the PLO man that he more or less recruited. But as I recall reading your fine book, there were huge internal battles within the CIA because they wanted him to sign a contract, sign on the dotted line, and he basically just wanted to share information. He didn't want to be a controlled asset.
Absolutely right.
Lansdale had a very similar struggles because, he didn't believe. I mean, it was kind of. He really believed in friendship and empathy and in political action. He didn't believe in paying off or blackmailing people to provide information. And he thought that what he was doing was in the best interest of the countries he was operating in, whether it was the Philippines or Vietnam. So it was a little bit different when he was recruiting agents, like in North Vietnam. There was obviously more of or in Cuba, those were obviously more subversive efforts, but he wasn't very successful at that. That really was not his strong suit. His strong suit was really getting along with people and befriending them. And it was very interesting what happened after he left South Vietnam at the end of 1956, where he cultivated a very strong relationship with Ngo Dinh Diem, but he was not replaced, and there was no American who took his place as this kind of trusted counselor to Diem. And the CIA immediately went back to its comfort zone, which was paying a maid in the presidential palace to steal Diem's waste paper basket and take the contents of the CIA station where it could be analyzed. And Lansdale thought stuff like that was just ridiculous, because instead of like stealing Diem's trash, he would just go to talk to Diem personally, and Diem would tell him pretty much anything he wanted to know. So, but you know, that stealing the trash thing is really, that's kind of like classic agency tradecraft. That's what they believe in doing. And he was constantly at odds with his superiors in the agency, who didn't think he should be engaging in political action and nation building, all this kind of stuff. Why wasn't he just, you know, stealing secrets? And he had a very different conception, and so, you know, he never became a professional career officer
Right.
for that reason.
No, it's extraordinary too that he could get so close, develop such close friendships with difficult people like Diem.
Yep.
And he didn't know, but he didn't know the language. He didn't know French even.
Right.
Never learned Vietnamese. You talk in the book in the Philippines how, you know, in the Philippines it was a little easier because they have much more, English is much more prevalent. But even in the Philippines, he could, at times he would use sign language and drawings in the sand, and
Yes.
and he could get away with this. It's
Yeah.
quite remarkable.
And that's him right there on the screen with Lansdale and Mag Saysay, with whom he became very close, defense minister of the Philippines in 1950, and later president, and Lansdale orchestrated his presidential campaign. Of course, obviously the language barrier did not exist with Mag Saysay, who was fluent in English. It was a little bit more of a problem with, just fast forwarding here to, there he is with Diem, who only spoke French and Vietnamese, so he had to work through a translator.
But Diem spent 2 years in America, didn't he? At some point, he must
He
have
did.
had some.
He lived in a seminary in New Jersey,
Right.
but did not really, I think he understood some English, but did not actively speak
So the
it.
language barrier was real.
The language barrier was real, so you had to work through a translator. That's Lansdale sitting there with, in the middle there. Does he have a pointer there? Maybe not. No, sort, I guess. Okay, the guy with the mustache in the middle, Lansdale, and Diem at the end there. And yes, they did work through a translator, but they still managed to establish a close relationship. Not as close as with Mag Saysay, because they were, Lansdale and Mag Saysay were like brothers, roommates for a while, and Diem just did not let outsiders get that close to him, but they still, he still became his closest American contact. And I think, you know, the secret of it was that Lansdale really listened to Diem. I mean, he listened to everybody. That was really the secret of his success, that he listened rather than lectured. And that was not always easy to do with somebody like Diem, who was a notorious windbag, who would go on for hours at a time and bore the pants off of most of his American interlocutors. But, you know, Lansdale was made of sterner stuff and probably had a stronger bladder, and would sit there for hour after hour listening to Diem drone on. And then at the end of that, he would say, well, that's fascinating, Mr. President. If I understand what you're saying, it's X, Y, and Z. And then he would rephrase what Diem had told him, putting across his own ideas, but making Diem think that he had thought of it himself. And that's a very subtle and very effective method of operating. It works with bosses, it works with spouses, and it definitely works with foreign heads of state.
So some of the reviewers of your book have advanced the criticism that you're engaged in propagating a little wishful thinking, that along the lines of, if Lansdale's advice had been taken, if he'd been listened to by McNamara or the Bundys or Johnson or Kennedy, that the war would have had a different outcome. We could have won the war. But my close reading of the book, you actually say quite the opposite. It's in your conclusion, you say, well, you know, I think, I'm paraphrasing you, that you think that if Lansdale's vision had been pursued, the war might still have been, quote, lost, but it might not have. But in any case, it would not have been the bloody conflict that we know of, where millions died.
Right. I mean, I make a fairly modest claim because, you know, I can't honestly sit here and say that if only Lansdale had been listened to, everything would have worked out wonderfully and South Vietnam would still exist. There's no question that no matter what Lansdale did, North Vietnam would have been a formidable adversary.
They were determined.
With more will to win than we had. And they might have won whatever we did. But, I mean, one thing I'm pretty certain is if Lansdale's path had been taken, we would not have lost 58,000 Americans. You'd not have had millions of Vietnamese killed in the crossfire because he never wanted this kind of big unit conventional war in the first place. And
he was against boots on the ground.
He was against American boots on the ground, right, against bombing North Vietnam. He didn't think it was going to be successful. And he vehemently disagreed with people like McNamara and Westmoreland and others who thought that the war was simply a matter of arithmetic and that you could just kill the Viet Cong faster than they could be replaced. He was never thought that was a realistic prospect.
Yeah, you have this great anecdote, encounter between, well, several of them, between Lansdale and McNamara, where McNamara is trying to fill in the boxes numerically. Well, how are we going to do this? And Lansdale says, well, you have to have the X factor too. McNamara says, well, what is the X factor? And Lansdale says, well, what is the X factor? How would you define it?
Well, the X factor
Hearts and minds?
was, as Lansdale said, the X factor was the feelings of the population about how they wanted to be ruled, and that was ultimately going to be the most important thing of all. And of course, you know, then McNamara got excited hearing this and started writing X factor on his graph paper and said, okay, well, help me to calculate it. And Lansdale said, well, unfortunately, it can't really be calculated. It's incalculable. I mean, he actually tried to help him calculate it and came up, and as a result of his work, ultimately came up, the military came up with stuff like the Hamlet evaluation system to judge the degree of insurgent control, which was always a very kind of uncertain metric that was rigged by local commanders on a routine basis. But yeah, I mean, it was a fascinating clash between McNamara and Lansdale, two very, very different types. McNamara, of course, having come over to the Pentagon from having run the Ford Motor Company, graduate of the Harvard Business School, and in fairness, I should note, also graduate of my alma mater, UC Berkeley. And Lansdale was not such a, you know, McNamara was probably safe to say on some level brilliant. He loved numbers, you know, he loved systems analysis, thought that numbers could lead him to the quote-unquote right answer in every case. And Lansdale, not so academically brilliant. He was a UCLA dropout, but by that point, by 1961, he'd spent years in Southeast Asia, in the Philippines and Vietnam. And so when they first met, he tried to educate McNamara about the kind of war that was just breaking out. And Lansdale had just returned from Vietnam, brought some very simple captured weaponry from the Viet Cong, some rifles and pistols and stakes and so forth, all covered in mud and blood, and walked into McNamara's office and dumped these weapons on his immaculate desk and said, you know, Mr. Secretary, these are the weapons that are being used by our enemies in Vietnam. They're not very sophisticated, and the people using these weapons, you wouldn't even recognize them as soldiers, although that's how they think of themselves, but they're licking the soldiers on our side because they have the power of an ideal, the power of an idea, and the only way we're going to beat them is if the South Vietnamese on our side have the power of a more stronger competing idea. We're not going to bomb this revolution into oblivion, you know, which in hindsight sounds like fairly sage advice, but of course McNamara was, you know, invincibly armored in his ignorance and arrogance and chose to dismiss what Lansdale had to say and just assume that he wasn't bright enough to understand, you know, the higher mathematics and computers that McNamara and the whiz kids were going to bring to solve this minor little problem.
So one of the dramatic high points of the book, it seems to me, is the assassination of Diem. And it's, all historians agree it was a major turning point in the course of the war, and a turning point for Lansdale. Of course, he was horrified by what had happened. He had been very close to Ziem.
Yep. Yep.
And had argued with him to, he had been trying to push him to be more inclusive, more democratic, more tolerant of press criticism, and he was largely unsuccessful over time. I mean, by 1963, Ziem was operating very much inside his own cocoon. But if you go, I visited Vietnam myself and spent 2 weeks there in 2009. And I remember taking partly a bicycle tour through the Mekong Delta. And it's extraordinary. You go through these little villages and you suddenly realize they're all small shopkeepers, petty bourgeoisie, the Marxist terms. They're, small-time capitalists. They're small farmers, and it's like Vietnam has evolved to what we wanted it to be in 1961. And the irony is just, and that's the tragedy, of course. But wouldn't Lansdale have wouldn't he have felt vindicated today by what exists in Vietnam, with the exception, of course, the fact that it's still a Stalinist political regime that controls things. But economically, the country is a free market capitalist system, it seems.
I mean, there's a lot of ironies of history, and it develops along unexpected paths. And it is the case that now Vietnam has adopted the Chinese kind of Marxist, Market-Leninist model of keeping political control within the Communist Party, but greatly liberalizing the economic system. And so they do have a semblance of free market economics, although in my own time that I spent in Vietnam, I also hear a lot of complaints about corruption and kind of the stifling hand of the government, of officials like taking their cut out of businesses, and of course there's also squelching of dissent and liberal bloggers getting locked up and so forth. So I wouldn't say it's a democratic free market paradise, but it's certainly much better than it was 30 years ago. And of course the central irony is that in many ways Vietnam is becoming a de facto ally of the United States because they're afraid of their former patrons in China and see us as a hedge against Chinese domination. So yes, I mean, I don't think that's something that Lansdale would have expected, or anybody would have expected in the 1970s. It's worked out that way, but I mean, I think it's also worth pointing out that, it's been kind of a long and bloody road to achieve that. Not only, the American war with the millions of casualties, but then, the communist takeover, the millions of boat people, hundreds of thousands killed, then the communist takeover in Cambodia with some 2 million killed on the killing fields. But eventually the system, Vietnam liberalized and is obviously a much better country today. I mean, it's actually interesting to see. I mean, just in my travels, it still seemed to me that, Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, still seems like a much more bustling place than Hanoi, which I actually found Hanoi more interesting in many ways because it's, from a visitor standpoint, it's just better preserved. It has more of that colonial air, and whereas Ho Chi Minh City or Saigon is this kind of bustling Asian megacity. I mean, it does make you wonder if there was an alternative path, and again, I don't know that it could have been possible, but if the country had remained split in the way that North and South Korea are, or Taiwan and China, I mean, it's quite possible that South Vietnam today would be at a much higher level of economic development akin to South Korea or Taiwan, and probably a liberal democracy as well, but again, very, very hard to achieve under those circumstances. And I'm not, as I say, saying that this would have been necessarily achieved if Lansdale had been listened to.
So you talk quite a bit about other characters that cross the path of Lansdale, including John Paul Vann, and also I found most surprising Dan Ellsberg, whom apparently Ellsberg, worked for
Yeah.
Lansdale, and they liked each other, and you actually quote Ellsberg as saying, "I loved Lansdale."
Yeah, he said that to me just a few years ago.
Yeah.
It was actually great fun to see the movie The Post, for those of you who have seen it, about the Pentagon Papers. And in fact, the very first lines of spoken dialogue in that movie are, one Marine says to the other, "Who's the long hair?" And the answer is, "That's Ellsberg. He works for Lansdale at the embassy." And indeed he did. This was in 1965, where Dan Ellsberg was a former RAND analyst who went over to Vietnam and worked for, former Marine also, who worked for Lansdale, and he loved getting out of Saigon and going into the jungle with his little Swedish submachine gun and going with the Marines after the Viet Cong. And Lansdale introduced him to the guy who would become his best friend, John Paul Vann, and so they would go on these hair-raising adventures together in Vann's International Harvester Scout through these very dangerous roads that other Americans would not willingly drive down.
So contrast Lansdale with Vann. They had similarities. They both wanted to sort of win the war as such without great cost and blood and treasure. They wanted hearts and minds, but there are, I think, some differences too.
One thing, Lansdale did not commit statutory rape,
Right.
among other differences. I talk, and we can talk later if you want, about, there is a great romance in his life.
That's right. Yes.
But he was not as voracious in that realm as John Paul Vann was, at least in Neil Sheehan's telling. And Vann really seemed to have more demons driving him, whereas Lansdale was a kind of a very laid-back, mellow kind of guy who was largely, I would say, a one-woman man from what I can tell, although that one woman was not his wife, but nevertheless, one woman. In terms of professional outlook, they did have some resemblances because they both did not fit neatly on this hawk-dove scale, because both of them were very skeptical of the traditional hawk military perspective, conservative military perspective, that, the way to win is, as Kurt LeMay said in his ghost-written memoirs, to bomb North Vietnam into the Stone Age, and neither one thought that would actually succeed, because as was pointed out, in many ways North Vietnam was already in the Stone Age, insofar as they didn't have an industrial capacity that you could wipe out. So it wasn't clear what this bombing was going to achieve, and both Vann and Lansdale were very skeptical that these giant American combat formations thrashing around the backcountry of Vietnam would actually be able to achieve decisive military results, as in fact they did not, because the Viet Cong and even the main force NVA units, North Vietnamese Army units, could hear them coming from miles away and scatter before they could land a decisive blow. And in terms of what they actually wanted to do, I think there was a little bit of a difference in emphasis, because Vann was more than Lansdale, was kind of a conventional military guy who really focused on security and he really wanted to focused on trying to make the ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam.
He really thought that there was a chance to win the war on the ground and
with
battlefields.
Enabling basically the ARVN.
Yeah.
And he had some success with that, in fairness. In 1972 in the Easter Offensive, when Vann was a corps level advisor, really equivalent to a 2-star general, he took command of a large portion of the defense of South Vietnam, and at that point, you only had about a few thousand U.S. advisors, no more combat troops. There was a lot of air power, U.S. air power, to call on, but the advisors were able to call on the air power, and to essentially, a lot of the ARVN soldiers would fight well, but the officer corps was riddled with corruption, sectarianism, and factionalism, and so the advisors like Vann could make up for some of the weaknesses of the officer corps. Now, Lansdale's perspective, it wasn't really at odds. It was just a slightly different perspective, because although he was also very interested in making the ARVN more effective, he was also looking at kind of the top level political level in Saigon. That was really where he engaged. Although he was retired as a 2-star Air Force general, he never really focused on military stuff per se. He always thought that the political line of operations was always going to be the decisive one, and he really tried to develop top-level leadership in both Manila and Saigon that would be effective. He was kind of a leadership whisperer, and he was frustrated in that regard, especially after Ziem was overthrown and you had the succession of generals, none of whom were all that legitimate or competent. And so he tried to work with, for example, in the 60s with Win Cao Ki, this very flashy Air Force general who was the prime minister and later the vice president of South Vietnam, but Ki lost this power struggle to Win Van Tu, this kind of plodding army general who became the dominant strongman, and so Lansdale wasn't able to exert the kind of influence he had done in the 50s, but he was really focused on the political arena, I would say, whereas Van was more focused on military action, but I think their ideas were largely complementary.
And I'm also astonished that even after Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers, Lansdale, while he disapproved, he never repudiated Ellsberg, and they remain friends.
Yeah, he was, as I say, kind of a mellow, laid-back guy who was able to get along with all sorts of people. It was interesting because, Ellsberg certainly made a transition that neither Van nor Lansdale made, because he went from being a gung-ho super hawk who wanted to do as much as possible to defeat the Viet Cong to becoming an equally gung-ho super dove who, started saying that all the U.S. policymakers were war criminals and so forth, and then, of course, leaked the Pentagon Papers, which greatly embarrassed Lansdale because a lot of the Pentagon Papers concerned Lansdale. A lot of his operations from 1954 to 1956, which were leaked, and greatly embarrassed his friends in the Philippines and Vietnam, the people and the agents that he had worked with. And so he was not happy about that, obviously, but nevertheless, he did not repudiate Ellsberg, and they stayed in touch and had a friendly relationship. And as Ellsberg, very interesting, his comments were, he did tell me that he loved Lansdale, loved him still, and was tremendously impressed by him. And I thought very perceptive comment that he made that for casual observers, people didn't really know Lansdale. He could come across as kind of this hayseed, this very naive American, like the quiet American, the caricature that, not of Lansdale, but of this American agent that Graham Greene set out. And I think a lot of people kind of bought into that, including, I would say, folks like David Halberstam and Neil Sheehan, who wrote about Lansdale in a kind of passing way in the course of much larger books. But the point that Ellsberg made is that in private, Lansdale was actually a much more sophisticated and realistic analyst, and he was not drinking his own moonshine. He tried to put on a brave face in public, but certainly in private from very early on, he knew that the war was being lost and things were not going as well as the high command claimed, and that's confirmed by my reading of his declassified documents and his private letters and all that. He was actually he had 2 tours in Vietnam, one from 54 to 56, another one from 65 to 68, and almost as soon as he got there in August of 65, he understood how, this was at the very beginning of the American War, he understood that things were not going well, and he was extremely depressed from the beginning because he perceived that this path was not going to be successful.
And in between the 2 tours, he was put in charge of Operation Mongoose, which was an operation run by the CIA against Cuba to try to destabilize Cuba. And the Kennedy brothers were asking him to bring about the downfall of the Castro regime through covert means, sabotage operations and such. But again, Lansdale, you quote him saying to I forget which friend, that he really didn't believe it was possible because there was no chance that there was going to be an uprising by the Cuban people. There was no constituency for this. And yet he continued. He was the good cold warrior trying to follow orders.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that was certainly, I think, one of probably the episode in his career that he regretted the most, because it was such a failure, and his failure to, deliver Castro's head on a platter to the Kennedys cost him the ability to influence the course of U.S. policy in Vietnam. I mean, at the time, he was working in the Pentagon overseeing special operations, and he actually exerted a large influence on the development of the Green Berets, the Army Special Forces, and other Special Forces units. But in a way, his mystique by that point became his undoing, because by the early 60s, he was, for a secret agent, he was pretty well known. And,
Written about novels.
Yeah, he was said to be the model for the quiet American and the ugly American, and he had, the Kennedys knew him as the American James Bond and the T. Lawrence of Asia and the ugly American. And so he had quite a legend by that point. And so they turned to him after the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion, because they lost faith. They still wanted to get rid of
Lansdale opposed,
which
too.
Lansdale had opposed. And so that increased his stock. And of course, the conventional CIA lost credibility with the Kennedys because of the failure of the Bay of Pigs. But they still wanted to get rid of Castro, and even more so than ever, because Castro had humiliated Jack Kennedy, and so they were going to make him pay for that. But they lost faith in the CIA to do the job, and so they turned to Lansdale and made him operations director of Operation Mongoose, but with very little real authority. And Lansdale very quickly determined, as he was doing the initial workup, that the only way you were going to get rid of Castro in short order was with an American military invasion. And this the Kennedys did not want to do. They wanted some kind of covert action gimmick that would enable them to get rid of Castro at little cost. And so Lansdale, working with kind of a wacky crew of military and intelligence personnel, including this legendary CIA officer, William King Harvey, and others, in 1962 tried to come up with schemes for a covert action that would overthrow Castro. And of course, none of them had much chance of success. And then later on, 13 years later, when you had the Church Committee hearings in 1975, and a lot of this stuff came out, it was greatly embarrassing.
Testify.
You had to testify. I mean, everybody had to testify. It was greatly embarrassing. I mean, the Church Committee was mainly focused on assassination plots, and Lansdale could more or less plausibly, I think, say that he wasn't really involved in assassination plots, largely because William King Harvey, the CIA man, didn't tell him anything and operated on a need-to-know basis and didn't think that Lansdale needed to know. But it was still pretty embarrassing, and there was this thing called and this was actually going back to our earlier discussion about how professional CIA people did not like Lansdale because he was at odds with their methods, and they especially did not like him in Mongoose because at this point, the CIA had failed with the Bay of Pigs. So if Lansdale had succeeded in overthrowing Castro with Mongoose, where the Bay of Pigs had failed, this would be a devastating blow to the CIA. I mean, they were worried that the agency would be disestablished. It would be such a crippling blow, and so they basically had a bureaucratic interest in undercutting Lansdale at every turn. And then finally, I mean, they were gleeful when the operation failed and Lansdale was discredited. And then in 1975, all these CIA officers were eager to talk about what they viewed as Lansdale's madcap schemes, and including this one which became famous after the Church Committee report was published, which they dubbed sarcastically, elimination by illumination. And this was a kind of a classic Lansdale psychological warfare scheme, the idea being to have a U.S. Submarine surface off the coast of Havana at night and fire star shells into the sky, and then couple this with a rumor campaign that the second coming was nigh, and that, to rise up against Fidel Castro, the atheist, because the savior was returning to save the people of Cuba. I mean, it sounded and was kind of nuts, but it wasn't any nuttier than all the stuff that the CIA came up with.
But it was an idea that Lansdale...
It wasn't, it was because he actually denied to the Church Committee that he had ever said this. He said it was a lie and it was a smear and so forth, but I actually found in his newly declassified papers a document which was in fact this very proposal that he had made, which he had either forgotten about or just straight lied about in 1975. But in fairness to him, it wasn't like he was uniquely madcap. In fact, even long before he joined anti-Castro efforts and long after he was gone, the CIA was coming up with all sorts of even crazier schemes on their own, like trying to feed Castro some kind of drug that would make his beard fall out, or plant an exploding seashell where he liked to go skin diving, so he would pick it up, or impregnate his wetsuit with some kind of botulism. All sorts of bizarre schemes to get rid of him, because it was kind of a feverish atmosphere at the time.
Yeah, he had a personality trait that you refer to as kiss up, kick down, and he did just the opposite. So this may explain why he had so many problems with people in positions and authority
Right.
over him. But he was very gentle and patient with people beneath him. So again, it's an example of what a nice guy he was.
He was basically, I mean, he really was a nice guy, and people, most of the people who worked for him worshipped him. Not exclusively. One of the people who worked for him was this wacky conspiratorial Air Force officer named Fletcher Prouty, who decades later would accuse him of being the mastermind of the Kennedy assassination based on one photo showing him from the back. Here, I'll just scan to this very quickly here. This was at the very beginning. There it is. So Fletcher Prouty claimed that this photo showing this guy from the back walking by a couple of these tramps in Dallas was in fact General Lansdale, and he was there to mastermind the Kennedy assassination, which seems like kind of a thin evidentiary base on which to lay a charge of murdering the president. But Oliver Stone actually made this the basis of his movie JFK, and a lot of people believe it. I mean, I was in Austin a few weeks ago and had this conspiracy monger debating with me whether Lansdale killed JFK or not. But Fletcher Prouty, the guy who spread this crazy tale, was removed. Lansdale thought he was a nut and removed him from his office, and so he probably had a grudge against him. But yes, by and large, Lansdale inspired great devotion among the people who worked for him. But he was also so he was a good guy in that way, but he was also kind of self-defeating, because he was not afraid to fight with his superiors and tell them off in ways that made him a lot of enemies along the road, and eventually more enemies than he could handle. And in the 50s, he managed to survive because he had the support of the Dulles brothers, CIA Director Allen Dulles and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, and they enabled him to run roughshod over local ambassadors and generals and so forth. But in the 60s, he, especially after the failure of Mongoose, he didn't have that kind of top-level support. And his biggest champion in the Johnson administration was Vice President Humphrey, who did not exert a lot of influence over the president's Vietnam policy. And so he was ultimately left powerless before his many, many bureaucratic enemies.
So this is a deeply biographical story, and you referred earlier to the great love of his life. It's a fabulous story. But it's curious. I mean, he falls in love with Pat, this beautiful Filipino.
There she is.
There she is.
Pat Kelly.
And
Ed Lansdale, circa 1946.
But he could not leave Helen, his wife.
Yes, right there, Helen.
And you sprinkle your whole story throughout the book with quotes from his love letters to Pat.
Yes.
So here's a question for the biographers in the room. How did you get your hands on these letters?
Good question. Well, there they are, the letters in question. And I got lucky because I tracked down Pat Kelly's granddaughter, who actually lives in Northern Virginia. Pat Kelly was this Filipino woman, in case you're wondering why she's named Pat Kelly. Her husband, who died during World War II, was of Irish-Filipino ancestry, hence the Kelly. But her granddaughter, Patricia Yee, who lives in Northern Virginia, I managed to track her down and went over to her house, and she said to me, "Hey, would you be interested in these letters in my basement?" And I said, "Boy, would I." And those are actually the letters laid out on her ping pong table. And just an amazing find, because she had saved, her grandmother had given her all these love letters that Lansdale had written to her over the course of many years, which she had not shared with anybody else before, and she allowed me to photocopy them. And then at the same time, I also contacted Lansdale's kids, his boys, of course now in their 60s and 70s. Ed Lansdale, or formerly known as Ted, but now he wants to be known as Ed, who lives on Long Island, and Pete, who's a retired telephone company executive and lives out in Florida. And they shared with me the letters that he wrote to their mother, Helen, often simultaneously with the letters that he was writing to Pat. And so I became the first person after Lansdale himself to have read both sets of letters, and that provided a fascinating vantage point into his innermost thinking that nobody else has had before. So it was just fascinating. It allowed me not only to, into this, vast unknown area of his life, which he had covered up for years in his memoir, which was very unrevealing, very dry and unrevealing in the midst of wars, which came out in 1972 while his wife Helen was still alive. The only mention of Pat Kelly was among a list of like 100 people that he thanked on the acknowledgments, and she was probably the most important person in his life. And so I really enjoyed being able to restore her to the position of prominence.
The letters are really extraordinary and loving and flirtatious, erotic.
Yes.
And I guess in sort of a 1950s kind of style, unabashedly sexist.
Yes.
And here's one example. He writes to Pat, "I've just worn out shoes running around and haven't even had a chance to kiss a girl's hand, much less other parts of her anatomy." He's writing to her from Vietnam, I think.
Yeah, right.
They're very private and
yes, I felt very
letters.
voyeuristic reading them.
Yes.
I mean, it's interesting because just from the standpoint of writing about Lansdale's professional life, initially I would say his letters to his wife Helen, and this is Helen, this is at the time of their marriage in 1933. She was actually about 7 years older than him, and so the age difference became more of an issue, I think, later on. But initially his letters home from the Philippines to Helen were in some ways more informative because they were, at least from my vantage point, because they were much more matter of fact about, they were kind of recitations of his professional life and his, what he was doing at the workplace, whereas the letters to Pat tended to be much more of a heavy breathing variety, talking, many, many times about how much he loved her and loved the spot behind her knee and so forth and so on. But of course, human nature being what it is, after 10 years into the relationship or so, the letters to Pat Kelly also became a lot more factual and less heavy breathing.
Well, but then there's also another major turning point in the relationship when he finally leaves to be posted back to America.
Yeah, at the end of 1956.
56, and Pat writes this, and you quote the whole letter.
Yes.
It's so important. You decided to quote the entire letter. It goes on for a page and a half. And
yeah, I was crying when I first read that. It was very sad. It was a letter from Pat. They'd had this 10-year relationship, and in that time, between 1946 and 1956, he had spent almost all his time in Asia, in the Philippines and Vietnam, most of that time with Pat, seen very little of his wife Helen, his two boys, Ted and Pete, and they had this very devoted relationship, and he had, initially asked Helen for a divorce, which she refused to grant, and very hard in those days to get a contested divorce, and so they stayed married, and then finally at the end of 1956, Lansdale's time in Asia was coming to an end. He was due to leave Vietnam, go back to Washington and move back in with Helen and the boys, and so Pat wrote him this very heartbreaking letter, this breakup letter, basically saying that he was making a big mistake, but it was better to call it off then.
And reading that letter, I thought, oh, the next thing that's going to happen is he's going to leave his wife, but he didn't.
No, she left him. She finally left him in a permanent way in 1972 when she died, and nobody knows what she died of because she was a Christian Scientist, so she didn't have traditional medical care. But she died, this was 1972, this was after his second tour in Vietnam from 65 to 68, so they were living together again for about 4 years in retirement. and I think had a sort of contented relationship at that point. But then she died in 1972, and then Pat Kelly, who by that point had retired from the U.S. Information Agency in Manila and was a grandmother by that point, but had never remarried, still single. And so they got in touch, and within a year she moved to Washington, and on July 4th, 1973, they got hitched. And
they're married for 14 years?
Yeah, lived happily ever after until Lansdale's own death at the end in 1987. And so they did have, his professional life did not have such a happy ending with the fall of South Vietnam and the undoing of everything he tried to achieve, but his personal life found a little happiness, and there they are, the lovebirds in the kitchen of their home in Northern Virginia, I would say probably in the late 70s, 1970s.
So on that note, I've monopolized the conversation, but let's have questions from the audience.
Thank you. So I guess I'd like to raise kind of one of the obvious questions that's been in all of a lot of the reviews is about comparing Lansdale's participation in Vietnam to the Iraq War, the neoconservative interest in the Iraq War, the universalism of bringing democracy to the Middle East, and how personally people wrestle with their own responsibility and come to terms with what another road could have been taken. So my question is first, do you draw comparisons between yourself and Lansdale or other neoconservative thinkers in terms of their responsibility for Iraq or the implications of Iraq? And secondly, do you think that maybe you're still kind of defending a neoconservative line in your defense of Lansdale by this universalism of democracy, that you're saying if that had been followed, maybe that would have been different, but isn't it possible that that was precisely the problem, was bringing democracy to Vietnam, and the American model led to the catastrophe, just as this catastrophe in Iraq?
Yeah, I've seen that kind of criticism, which I frankly find puzzling because I certainly did not write this book thinking of the Iraq War, and it certainly is not meant to be a justification for the Iraq War, which in hindsight was obviously a mistake. And, this is, some of these, the reviews I would say have been overwhelmingly positive, but there have been a few negative reviews which, somehow suggest that I am this bloodthirsty warmonger who in this book is also advocating endless war, American occupation, et cetera, whereas I actually kind of thought it was more or less the opposite, because as I've been mentioning, Lansdale was somebody who was very much opposed to a massive American military role in Vietnam, and I'm quite sympathetic to his viewpoint. Now, he also, I suppose, the parallel is, some people still think that because he tried to support and save the state of South Vietnam, that somehow his work led us inevitably into this bloody quagmire. And I would push back against that, because it wasn't really his decision to support the state of South Vietnam. I mean, that was more or less a consensus within the U.S. foreign policy establishment in the 1950s. Now, you can criticize that consensus, and certainly you can say from the benefit of hindsight, if we had known that all our intervention in Vietnam was going to do was to lead to 58,000 dead Americans, millions of dead Vietnamese, and the fall of South Vietnam, better to have stayed out altogether. Pretty obvious in hindsight, but that certainly was not the mindset of policymakers in the 40s and 50s who were enthralled to the domino theory and feared that if Vietnam fell, then it would be Thailand and Malaysia and Indonesia, and so you had to stop the march of communism there, and it was really a question of how you're going to go about doing it. And I would say that Lansdale's approach was the most humane and the most low-key, and the one that involved the least amount of risk to American lives, and also was the most sparing of Vietnamese lives, because he did want to support South Vietnam, but he wanted to do it with advisors, not with massive bombing campaigns and American combat troops. Now, this still offends people who think that Ho Chi Minh was the rightful ruler of all of Vietnam. I would push back against that a little bit, because I mean, if you read some of the more recent historiography, the picture it generally paints is that the Vietnam War was really a civil war between two different strands of Vietnamese nationalism, each of those strands having outside superpower support. Of course, you had the communist strand represented by Ho Chi Minh, but there was also a genuine nationalist, non-communist strand of Vietnamese nationalism, which, you know, Ho Chi Minh repressed non-communist nationalists in North Vietnam, often very bloodily, but there was a genuine non-communist nationalist movement, and so it was a civil war to see which side would emerge on top. And, you know, Lansdale unabashedly thought it would be better for the non-communist side to emerge on top. I mean, you can criticize that, but I think that is a defensible viewpoint, and I am kind of puzzled by this leap that if you think that, and by the way, I would add, you know, on the subject of democracy promotion, I would not say that Lansdale was a crazed democracy promoter. He did think that it was better to have government that was accountable and honest and in touch with the people, but he was certainly able to understand distinctions, and that's why, for example, in 1963, he was very much opposed to the overthrow of Diem, even though he thought that Diem was being too dictatorial, and he would have loved to have been sent back to Vietnam to try to moderate Diem's crackdown and to rule in a more consensual fashion. But nevertheless, he recognized that Diem was the least bad option and that he was going to be better than the generals who would come after him. So he wasn't taking some kind of absolutist position and saying, because Diem was not a Democrat, then we should not support him. I mean, he was willing to make some compromises, but when he was there from 54 to 56, he worked hard, and not always successfully, to try to moderate Diem's dictatorial instincts. And you know, a lot of Diem's authoritarianism became really dominant after Lansdale left, when his brother No Dinh Nhu became the dominant influence, kind of this fascistic, conspiratorial thinker. So that's all kind of a long-winded way of saying I think that, you know, Lansdale tried to do the best he could in Vietnam. He loved the people of South Vietnam. He wanted to protect them from communist rule, and I think if you look at the record, it wasn't like there was any mass uprising in South Vietnam in favor of communism. I mean, the North eventually won with an armored invasion, not with a popular uprising. So, you know, I think he was trying to do the best that he could, and I think, again, I kind of struggle and strain to figure out what this has to do with the Iraq War. And I mean, there's a lot of people, I guess, who think that because I supported the war in Iraq initially, along with about 72% of the American public, this is some kind of original sin for which I can never be forgiven. And if it makes you feel better, I'm happy to say that in retrospect, I think it was a massive mistake, and obviously done under the misapprehension that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, which I don't think was a deliberate lie on the part of the Bush administration. It was just bad intelligence, but that's what it was. And so in hindsight, yeah, I mean, obviously a big mistake. So, I mean, if it makes you feel better, I'm happy to say that. But again, I don't think it has much to do with my book, which is not a political tract, but a historical study.
But Max, we've now been fighting how many years in Afghanistan in a sort of low insurgency warfare? And some people might read your book as sort of a justification for a strategy for winning in Afghanistan. And the critics, and I think your question is getting at, well, maybe the problem is the intervention itself, that it's impossible to think that we could intervene in a place like Afghanistan or Iraq. We Americans don't understand the internal politics. You know, your own descriptions of Lansdale's understanding of the internal politics of South Vietnam, the various warlords, and was fascinating. But even he struggled to make sense of a very confusing political theater. And, you know, I read your book and I think, My God, this is an argument for why we Americans must avoid the arrogance of thinking that we can intervene liberally even in very complicated foreign lands like Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, that's a totally legitimate interpretation to draw. I mean, the kind of the lesson that I draw at the end is that, I mean, I think it's hard to avoid getting involved altogether because unless you're, you know, a true isolationist, because the reality is that things that happen abroad can come back to threaten us. I mean, obviously hard to avoid getting involved in Afghanistan when that's the place where we've been attacked and had 3,000 Americans killed from. But even today, I mean, we face terrorist threats from many states, so it's hard to take, you know, I think it's very hard to take an altogether hands-off attitude and say, we're just not going to get involved unless you think that the only reason we're targets is because we are involved however much. And I think, you know, I don't think we're going to really find safety in a Rand Paul type of isolationist policy. And so I think the question is if you do admit that there are security threats out there and we do have security interests as a global power, you know, the question is how do you meet those interests? And I think what I basically advocate in the book is rather than a massive military approach, I think the Lansdale approach of small-scale advisory teams trying to work with foreign leaders with empathy and trust and gently guiding them along a path of expanding their capabilities and providing some aid for them to do that, I try to suggest that offers a more effective approach than kind of kinetic military power of bombs and bullets, which can achieve short-term tactical results, but often does not achieve lasting strategic results. Now, if that makes me a bloody neocon warmonger, so be it, but I think the terms are being stretched beyond their meaning.
Times he mentions Archimedes Patty as Ho Chi Minh's World War II godfather. Do you care to elaborate on that and tie it into all of this?
Well, Archimedes Patty was one of the OSS officers who parachuted into northern Vietnam at the end of World War II to try to make trouble for the Japanese and to raise an insurgency against the Japanese. And of course, they did wind up working with Ho Chi Minh and the communists and in fact helped to save Ho Chi Minh's life when he got sick, and they provided life-saving drugs. Now, you can argue about what the moral of that story is. I mean, some people have suggested that we should have reached out to Ho Chi Minh, and he tried to reach out to us. He actually wrote letters to President Truman, and you know, when he declared independence for the new state of Vietnam in 1945, he quoted from the Declaration of Independence. And so some people have suggested this was this great missed opportunity, that he could have become an American ally instead of an enemy if only we'd worked with them. I think that's a little bit naive because while Ho Chi Minh was a genuine Vietnamese nationalist, he was also a pretty dedicated communist who had been trained at the Stalin School, had lived in Moscow during the Stalinist purges in the 30s, had spent years working for the Comintern, and he was not a liberal Democrat. I mean, the reason he was quoting from the Declaration of Independence and writing to President Truman was basically as a political ploy because he wanted to avoid American support for the French war effort in their attempts to regain power in Indochina. And of course, when he finally consolidated power in northern Vietnam after 1954, he did it with a heavy hand and killed tens of thousands of people in order to consolidate communist rule. So I don't think he was ever going to be a liberal Democrat, but I think it is the case that in hindsight, it's obvious that that U.S. policymakers in the 40s and 50s were too much enthralled to this notion of communism being this monolithic entity, and they were not alive at that point to the possibility that a communist state would not necessarily be answerable to Moscow or Beijing, but would in fact pursue an independent policy. That's something that first became evident after Tito broke from Stalin in Yugoslavia. And so I think, you know, the misapprehension about Ho Chi Minh was not thinking that, that the guy was a communist. He really was a communist. The misapprehension was not understanding how important Vietnamese nationalism would be and how that would mean that even if the communists took over in Vietnam, they would not be puppets of China or the Soviet Union.
I just think that the Iraq and Vietnam are just apples and oranges that are not worth talking about in the same sentence. But I wanted to ask about at the end of the French Indochina War, Eisenhower, had he allowed free elections for Vietnam, would there have been a different outcome? Have you thought about that?
You're asking about the unification elections?
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Well, just to give the background very briefly, you had the Geneva Conference in 1954, which International Great Power Conference, which divided Vietnam into North Vietnam and South Vietnam, and it was supposed to result in a unification election in 2 years' time. And of course, the U.S. Had no interest in holding that election. And in fairness, we were not actually signatories to the Geneva Accord, so we weren't legally obligated to do so. But the reason why we didn't want to hold that election was because we were pretty convinced, and probably rightly so, that Ho Chi Minh would have won. A, because he was a genuine nationalist hero, he had just defeated the French, and B, because he also exerted police state control over North Vietnam, which was more popular than South Vietnam, so there was no way to hold a genuinely free and fair election. If there had been, Ho Chi Minh probably still would have won that too, but there was not really a lot of serious thought given to holding that election.
Who has the mic?
I was wondering if you could comment the relative success of Lansdale working with Magsaysay in the Philippines versus only very limited success that he had in 1954 to 1956 in Vietnam. Was it because Magsaysay and his forces were more into the hearts and minds concept that Lansdale had, and there was much less of that with the Diem regime in the south of Vietnam?
Yeah, there were definitely some important differences between the Philippines and South Vietnam. The Philippines, of course, was more Americanized after a half century of American rule. They had some tradition of democracy, although very imperfect. They were also, the communist insurgency in the Philippines, the Hook Rebellion, was also isolated from outside support. All very different, of course, in the case of South Vietnam. And of course, a major difference that you alluded to was that Magsaysay, the guy you worked with in the Philippines, was a much more charismatic, outgoing, natural kind of politician than No Dinh Diem, who was this very reclusive, scholarly Mandarin who was not really a man of the people. So there were vast differences. You know, I will say that, you know, when Lansdale arrived for his second tour in the Philippines in 1950, it wasn't like he was preordained for success. In fact, a lot of people in Washington thought that the Philippines was on the verge of falling to the Hook insurgency, and there was talk of sending large-scale U.S. ground forces to prevent that. And Lansdale actually achieved results far beyond what was expected by masterminding the defeat of the Hook Rebellion. And then I would say from 54 to 56, he also exceeded expectations, because when Diem was appointed in the summer of 1954, very few people thought that he would last 9 weeks, much less 9 years, because he had so many threats. And it wasn't just the communists, it was also the French were hostile to him. You had all these sects in South Vietnam that had their own independent armies. So he faced a multiplicity of enemies. And again, I think Lansdale's support was crucial to enabling him to consolidate his power. But at the end of the day, obviously, his success in Vietnam was much more limited and transitory. Although I will say, even in the case of the Philippines, it was somewhat transitory, because the Hook Rebellion was defeated, but then after Magsaysay tragically died in this airplane crash in 1957, a lot of the kind of corrupt political elements that Magsaysay and Lansdale had battled once again became ascendant, and eventually Marcos got elected and then declared martial law and became a dictator, and then once again you had a new communist insurgency as well as an Islamist insurgency in Mindanao. So there's also that great what if of Philippine history. You know, what if Magsaysay had lived?
Yes, the mic is coming to you.
I'm sure you cover this in the book, which I haven't had a chance to read yet, so I apologize. But what's the source? What are the sources of Lansdale's approach? Did he sort of come up with these ideas on his own based on his experience and some innate wisdom that he had, or was he influenced by writers, thinkers, leaders that he had met, or did he go even further back? Was he sort of an amateur historian who had looked at this?
Well, I would say his two biggest influences were probably A, the Founding Fathers, and B, Mao Zedong. And he was largely self-taught. He was, his life should give inspiration to see students everywhere. But he was a great devotee of the Founding Fathers, and he did believe, I mean, this was the question asked earlier, I mean, he certainly did believe in the principles of the Declaration of Independence of all men created equal and endowed with their creator with certain inalienable rights. And he did think that it was, and he did want to promote those ideals to the best of his ability. But he also was a canny student who was one of the early Americans to read Mao and understood the political imperative in Mao's work, that it was all about political organization. It wasn't just about imposing the will at gunpoint, although there was some of that, but it was about, the importance of commissars in the Red Army and of political organization work in villages in order to prepare them for a communist takeover. And in some ways, Lansdale was trying to do kind of a free world alternative to Mao, using Maoist methods to beat Mao, because he thought that the principles in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were these powerful ideals that were even more powerful than the principles in the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital and in Mao's Little Red Book. And so his hope was, to inspire people in Asia with those ideas instead of with the Marxist ideas, but also focusing on political organization work. And crucially, in both cases, the tactics were similar because, Mao told the Red Army that they had to treat the peasantry well, not steal from them, not rape their women, and so forth and so on, so to make themselves welcome among the villagers. And Lansdale preached the exact same idea, that the army had to treat the people as brothers and win them over instead of being heavy-handed and bombarding barrios and so forth. And so those were his influences, and also, of course, the fact that he had this background in advertising, so he had this natural interest in psychological warfare, and so and putting all these elements together, he became a pioneer in what would today be called counterinsurgency doctrine.
Yes, Eleanor.
Halberstam, Sheehan, other journalists, one of the things that they talked about when they covered Vietnam was that the only way you could find out the truth about what was going on was to talk to the sort of mid and lower level officers. What kind of relationship did Lansdale have with those officers, but also with the, Westmoreland and the other generals there?
Talking to lower-level American officers or Vietnamese?
Yes. Did he
Okay.
talk to American officers? Did he deal with them at all? Or
So he was probably more likely to deal with the Vietnamese, and that was really where he sought to gain most of his information. He was, he spent a lot, he wound up spending, over roughly 6 years in Vietnam, maybe a little more. But he tried to meet as many people as possible and developed a lot of friends and across all walks of life, not just in the military, obviously, but also, all sorts of labor people and religious leaders and ordinary shopkeepers and peasants and so forth. And he tried to go out in the countryside as much as possible and to learn as much as he could. And that was kind of his reality check, and that's why he understood in the 60s, for example, that these optimistic reports of progress that were going up the chain of command with the body counts and all this kind of stuff was BS, because it wasn't supported by the evidence on the ground. I don't think I'm sure he certainly talked to American officers and people like John Paul Vann and others, especially, who were, he talked to a wide variety of people. It certainly wasn't, but it wasn't limited to the Americans, and I would say primarily the Vietnamese. And in fact, there are limitations to this, obviously, because he did not speak Vietnamese, but he did become a student of Vietnamese society and wrote these papers on the structure of Vietnamese politics and the different factions, and he was fascinated by all this stuff, Vietnamese folklore and myth and all that. He was really fascinated by the society as a whole, and not just the military aspects of it. That was, I think, one thing that set him apart from a lot of Americans, that he wasn't just looking at it through this narrow military prism. He was really trying to understand the society as a whole.
So Max, I want to know if you've been invited by the CIA to come to Langley for a book event.
You know, it's funny because we actually, one of our visiting fellows at the council, Mike Dempsey, who was the former Deputy Director of National Intelligence, actually put me in touch with the CIA Historical Office and suggested that they invite me out to speak. Like I'm going, I mean, I've spoken at a bunch of military installations, you know, Fort Benning, Army War College. I'm speaking at National Defense University next week. I'm speaking at the State Department tomorrow. But the CIA is always very hard to get. And they got back to me and saying, well, you know, we have to vet this with our historians to make sure that it's all 100% accurate. So
Really?
I'm expecting about 10 years I'll get a call back once they finish the vetting process.
Incredible. All right, so the CIA's bias against Lansdale is still alive.
That could well be the case. I don't think he's ever been the flavor of the month at Langley.
Well, any other questions?
In college, I had a French government professor who pointed out that the Berlin blockade was the pivotal point for Vietnam.
What was the pivotal point?
The Berlin blockade.
Oh, Berlin blockade. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
In other words, that Truman was just totally afraid that, like the Russians pushed west, that Ho Chi Minh, was there no one around at that time that debunked the domino theory?
There were people. I mean, there was, I think, I'm blanking on his name, but I think the very first CIA officer killed in South Vietnam, who died very early in the French War, actually thought that it was a huge mistake to be backing the French war effort. But that was obviously not the dominant viewpoint. I mean, Lansdale himself, when he visited Vietnam for the first time in 1953, was very skeptical of what the French were doing because he remember, he always believed in the political endgame, and he said there was no political endgame there because you could never get the Vietnamese to go along with colonial rule, and which is what the French were fighting for, and that's why he thought it was important when we intervened ourselves to keep a very low footprint and to champion Vietnamese nationalism rather than to try to impose this new imperialism. And that was one of the things he was actually afraid of in the 60s, was it felt like this new American imperialism because all of a sudden you've got 500,000 troops and this vast economic infrastructure, and it's imposing this vast foreign influence on Vietnam, which he thought was the last thing you ought to be doing.
Yeah, because as I understand it, under Eisenhower, the first 2 years, we paid 50% of the war, and in the last 2 years, we paid 100%.
Right, and that was partially because we wanted French support in NATO and Europe, but also because of the fear of the domino theory that the communists would take over in Indochina, and then the rest of Asia would follow. And so that was, but Eisenhower, as you know, also resisted French pleas to commit American combat forces to save their bacon at Dien Bien Phu.
Yeah, but what I wonder is if we had done massive foreign aid to Ho Chi Minh right from the very beginning, could we have avoided this whole quagmire?
Well, as I said before, I mean, we could have avoided American intervention, but the trade-off would have been a communist takeover. I don't think that American aid to Ho Chi Minh would have transformed him into suddenly not being a communist, which he genuinely was. Now, again, in hindsight, you can say it's better if Vietnam is going to go communist anyway, why don't we just have that happen in the 40s instead of like in the 70s after 58,000 dead Americans, millions of dead Vietnamese. And yes, with the benefit of hindsight, that makes a heck of a lot of sense, but there weren't a lot of policymakers in the 40s or 50s who thought that way.
Well, but to be fair to the CIA, it was true that there were analysts, and Bill Bundy was privy to many of their reports because he was working in the CIA in the 50s, who argued that it was hopeless.
Right.
And that the American attempt to reverse things was going to suffer the same fate that the French had suffered. And Bill Bundy himself, I wrote in The Color of Truth in October of 1964, so just before the big landslide election in '64, wrote a 16-page memo, which he presented to McNamara, arguing that this was actually a civil war and that we were going to be falling into the same trap that the French had, and it was hopeless.
Yeah.
And McNamara, Bill Bundy comes in the next Monday morning, and McNamara tells him he has to withdraw the memo.
And Bundy was actually a fan of Lansdale. He was one of his champions in the bureaucracy because they were both very skeptical of the American war effort.
So they knew. They knew better, in a way. And, you know, people like Bill, but both brothers were, you know, subscribers in 1964 to the New York Review of Books, were therefore reading I.F. Stone. You know, so again, they knew better. And it's a mystery why they persevered in folly. Yes, sir.
Thank you for being here today. Question is, 57 odd years later, politicians' sons and daughters don't fight wars. What would you say to that? Also, what would you say to the horrifying treatment that continues even today, many of them homeless, of the Vietnam veterans as a result of the whole quagmire? And Hollywood's response in terms of its negative response of producing movies that tend to say, "You bad boys."
Well, I mean, I think it's unfortunate the treatment that a lot of Vietnam veterans received when they came home. I mean, I think there's a general sense in society that this was not the right thing to do, and I think there's been an attempt to make up for it in more recent years with the treatment of vets from Afghanistan and Iraq. And I think, you know, you have to separate the soldiers from whether you think that the war was worth fighting or not, because, you know, they were doing their duty and as best they could in the vast majority of cases. And I think you have to honor their service, even if you disagree with the cause in which they were fighting. And I don't think and obviously there were such emotions about Vietnam. I think that was very hard to do in the 70s. And I think now, I think with the Ken Burns series and, you know, now the passage of time, I think we can gain a more dispassionate, viewpoint on what happened.
Okay, one more question, and then we should end the evening.
Couple of quickies, if you please. If this country hadn't intervened in Vietnam, wouldn't that have caused a certain adventurism on the part of the Soviet Union? Certainly, causing trouble in other parts of the world, Cuba. And also, quickly, a few of the dominoes did fall. Laos briefly went communist, didn't it? And also, of course, Pol Pot, we know quite well in Cambodia. Maybe you can address the dynamics of that situation, too, put that in historical context. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the domino theory wasn't entirely crazy, at least as it applied to Indochina, because it was the case that, once South Vietnam was falling, then Laos fell and Cambodia fell. And of course, in Cambodia, the results were especially horrific with the genocide of the Khmer Rouge and several million people killed. And of course, you had, even from South Vietnam, you had masses of boat people, re-education camps. I mean, it wasn't a worker's paradise. I mean, it was a pretty brutal and bloody business. Interesting comment that Lee Kuan Yew, the Prime Minister of Singapore, made, which was that, he later said that the American war effort in Vietnam had actually bought time for other states in the region to solidify non-communist governments and that if we hadn't held the line in Vietnam for all those years, then countries like Singapore and others might well have fallen. Again, who the hell knows? I mean, this is entirely in the realm of counterfactual speculation, but I throw it out there for what it's worth. I mean, I tend to agree that the domino theory was somewhat exaggerated, and again, we did not perceive the importance of nationalist differences within the communist movement. I think a key intellectual failing in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, but, worth thinking about those counterpoints as well before you just dismiss it and say that it's all total nonsense. Well, those were the only ones that fell. Perhaps. I mean, again, hard to know. Hard to know. It's possible, but who knows?
Glenn?
Yes. You mentioned the Dulles brothers. Could you tell us a little bit more about how both Alan and John Foster, how they felt about what Lansdale was doing, how they, whether they were influenced by it, and were there any particular politicians that he was close to in the 50s and 54 to 56, some that might have taken his advice and enlisted him on the Hill in particular?
Well, there they are. There's Ed Lansdale with Allen Dulles in the 1950s. Dulles loved Lansdale. He was his kind of operative, much as he loved Kim Roosevelt, who orchestrated the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran. The Eisenhower administration loved covert action in general, as I'm sure you know, because Eisenhower wanted to protect U.S. security interests, but he didn't want to get involved in these massive ground wars, and so he saw covert action as being a low-key alternative. And Dulles himself, Allen Dulles, was sort of similar to Lansdale in that he did not like bureaucracy. He loved the romance of espionage, and he did not like the paperwork aspects of it. So he didn't like running this big bureaucracy. He loved swashbuckling exploits, and so people like Lansdale gave him all those exploits, and once he backed him up in the Philippines, and then once he delivered results and the Hook Rebellion was defeated, backed him up again in Vietnam, even when he clashed very hard with the four-star general, Lightning Joe Collins, who was the U.S. ambassador in Saigon, who was not a fan of ZM and just generally was not interested in the counterinsurgency approach that Lansdale was pushing, and Lansdale was essentially able to override him, go over his head to Dulles, and eventually have him relieved. Pretty amazing triumph for a colonel over a four-star general because of the patronage of the Dulles brothers, who were such powerful kingmakers in Washington in the 50s. And as I mentioned earlier, he suffered in the 60s from not having a champion that powerful in Washington, although initially President Kennedy was a huge fan. But then, as I mentioned, after Mongoose failed, the Kennedys soured on him, and he was essentially left naked before people like Robert McNamara and others who were much more hostile to him. But his period of greatest success was with the patronage of the Dulles brothers in the 50s.
Were there any people in Congress that particularly were in tune to what he was saying, or were backers of his or influenced by him? In the 50s?
He's not so much in the 50s. In the 60s, he had certainly backers in Congress, largely friends of Hubert Humphrey, because Humphrey became a big champion of his in the 60s, and you had various lawmakers like Senator Thomas Dodd of Connecticut, Chris Dodd's father, who lobbied Johnson to send Lansdale back to Vietnam. So he definitely had support. It tended to be kind of among kind of Cold War liberals, kind of hawkish Democrats, that was Lansdale's natural constituency.
Okay, I think we should end the evening on that note. Thank you very much,
you.
Max. Thank you.